Yes, well, we hear a lot in the news about people of colour, and there are lots of questions. How many people of colour are there in different professions? Even in the scientific news, the regular science news sites, how many people of colour are there in physics? That was one that recently came out. Well, in fact, we are all people of colour, and some of you may remember a Sunday school song, Jesus loves the little children, right? Red and yellow, black and white. Well, there are actually quite a lot of colours in human skin, and there's red and yellow, but not black and white. So the colours in human skin, yes, there are red and yellow, and there's two shades of brown. One is a very, very dark brown and one is a more reddish brown. But all people have all of these colours. So to understand how that all works, we need to have a brief look at how skin works. So here is a piece of skin that has been cut down vertically, and we're looking at the cut surface. So at the top we have the outside world, and down the bottom we have what's immediately under your skin, which is called the dermis. Now that is a mass of fibers and blood vessels, and in between the outside world and the dermis you have the epidermis, which is the outermost layer, which is what people see when they look at you. Now, the outermost layer of that is a layer called keratin. That is made by the cells in the epidermis. And the epidermis is very, very tightly bound to the dermis. And notice that the contours there, contours give the epidermis and the dermis a very, very large surface area of connection. So it's very, very tightly bound. All very good design there. We can go into all of that in detail, but we're just looking at colour today. So let's have a look at the different colours. Red is actually the hemoglobin, or the pigment that's in your red blood cells. So you can actually see that under your skin. That's why you look very dark red or very ruddy or flushed when you are hot or when you've been exercising and there's a lot of blood up close to the surface. The blood vessels can open and close. They don't close down completely, otherwise the skin would die. But there's always some blood flowing underneath the epidermis, in that dermis region where you've got a lot of blood vessels. So down in the dermis, in between, there's a sort of felt work of fibers, collagen fibers and elastic fibers. You have blood vessels running through there, and you do actually see the red from the red blood cells underneath that. And if there's a lot of blood, you look very red. And if there's not much, you don't look so red, depending on what other colours there are in between. So let's have a look at those. If we go right up the top, we actually find the yellow pigment, carotenoids, and we eat some of these and they're quite tasty. They're found in foods and they tend to get concentrated in that outermost layer. So the easiest place you can see them is where you've got very, very thick calloused skin, because you've got lots of keratin there. So I don't suggest you do this now, but you can have a look at the sole of your foot and you'll see there is a yellowish tinge there. So if we go back to our skin layers, up in the keratin layer, you will get carotenoids accumulating. If you have lots of these, your skin looks more yellowish. If the skin is thicker, it looks more yellowish. So again, we've got variation coming in straight away. Now it's the epidermis that has the two shades of brown. So we need to have a look at those a little bit more closely. That's from a pigment named melanin, and there are two variants of that which rejoice in the names of eumelanin and pheomelanin. Don't worry about that. Just think of black brown and red brown. And they are both made by melanocytes, which are specialist cells in the epidermis whose function is to just sit there and make melanin. And so the melanin is found in the epidermis, in that bottom layer, right? See the curved layer where it connects with the dermis. The melanin cells will sit in there, and they make lots of melanin. And they make it in various amounts. We'll explain that in a moment. Now, an interesting thing about melanocytes is that the number of cells, melanin-producing cells, is much the same for all of the racial groups. So whatever person of color you are, if you looked at the average number of melanocytes for different colored people, it's much the same. So what makes the difference? Because there is quite a difference. All right. Now, here are some melanocytes, and notice where they are. They're in the bottom layer. That is because the function of melanin is to protect the cells that are dividing in the epidermis. Epidermis is being constantly remade because it gets scraped off the top. Now, what happens is that cells in that bottom layer divide, and some of the cells will then move up into the next layer towards the surface, and they will start to fill up with keratin, and they will move further and further up and fill up with keratin and various other substances that make the skin waterproof until they eventually flatten out and become like little flakes, and then the internal structure of the cell just dies off, and so you're left with these keratin and waxy flakes. And the function of the melanin is to protect those dividing cells, because when cells are dividing, the DNA is vulnerable to being knocked about by various radiations and other things that will affect DNA. So it needs to be protected from the external world. So the melanocytes specialize in making melanin, but they export it to the keratin cells. So it's inside the keratin cells, but as the keratin cells move up through the layers, eventually you don't need that melanin anymore, so it does get broken down. But in some people, it persists. So that's another thing that will make a difference to the skin color. So it's the things that make a difference in the color variation is, for a start, how much of the eumelanin, the pheomelanin, in other words, the very dark blackish brown or the reddish brown, how much of each of those do the cells make? How active they are, how, cells need to be stimulated, they need to be turned on to, if they're a cell that produces substances for export. So how active they are, and then how much the melanin persists as you're forming these keratin layers. So there's a lot of scope for variation there. So if we combine all of those things, all people do have all of those colors, and the different skin colors that we see from the outside are just variations of that same color combination. But because you've got 4 different colors, because you've got different levels of melanin activity and different thicknesses of the skin, there's a big scope for a lot of different colors. So we're all persons of color. And how did we get the different color combinations? Now, the standard theory is that it evolved according to the different environments that people lived in as human beings evolved and then moved around over the earth. Well, does that check out? Well, we won't look that in real detail, but one thing that is commonly told is that skin color evolved because of changes in sunlight as you move around the earth. So we'll just have a brief look at this question. Has skin color evolved for the sun? Because the melanin particularly is there to protect us from ultraviolet rays from the sun, which do damage our DNA if they can get there. All right. So this is the standard story. Melanin protects the skin from damage from ultraviolet light from the sun. So dark skin evolved in the high ultraviolet regions. But skin does need some sunlight to make vitamin D, a really important vitamin. It's actually a hormone that has a lot of profound effects on our calcium in our body. And we all know that you need calcium to make strong bones. And also calcium is important in all sorts of other cellular functions as well. So you need vitamin D, and it can be made in the skin with stimulation from some of the ultraviolet rays. So light skin is supposedly an evolutionary product of living in a low ultraviolet region. Well, we can look at that. Now, ultraviolet light is going to be strongest near the equator, and it's going to sort of fade as you go away from the equator towards the poles, simply because of the angle of the sun changing as the sunlight goes through the atmosphere up towards the poles. It has to go through a thicker layer. So the standard story is the regions near the equator, plus some of the very high mountainous regions, like the Deccan Plateau, like the Andes Mountains. There will be a lot of ultraviolet light, but it fades away as you get towards the polar regions. Now, we can check that out by having a look at the color distribution all over the world, but not these days. This is actually from old data, because the world is so mobile at the moment, and has been for the last few hundred years. All right, we were stopped from being mobile for the last 2 years because of the coronavirus restrictions, but that's just a blip in the time. But this is a whole lot of data that was collected from what they call native populations. In other words, people who have supposedly lived in the same place and multiplied for generations, for over thousands and thousands of years. Now, in the last couple of hundred years, people have moved about, and there's been lots of mixing. And anyway, this research came up with this data for the different distributions of skin color. Now, if you have a look at Africa and Europe, it sort of works in terms of the dark and the light, and the relative distances away from the equator. But if you look at Australia and if you look at the Americas, it doesn't quite work, does it? So we need to do a sort of reality check, as it were. What can we really explain the different colors are? Well, it doesn't really work with dark color and light color. If we just compare, say, Australia and Europe. Now, you may think that, well, Australia is a tropical country. Well, the top half of Australia is certainly a tropical country. The bottom half is actually a temperate country, and it's almost as far away from the equator as a lot of Europe. So if we put on our lines of latitude, you have the equator going through the center there. 40 degrees away from the equator goes through Bass Strait. In Australia, it goes just below the mainland through and just above a small island called Tasmania. And 40 degrees north goes through the Mediterranean region. So goes through Spain, through the Mediterranean region. So it's not that far away from all of those light people who live in Europe and up into Britain and Scandinavia. And so how can we get our distinctive color combinations? Well, let's have a look at biblical history rather than evolution and see if we have a better explanation. Now, we need to think the biblical history starts off with everything being very good. And one of the questions we have had is, well, what was the original skin color? What color were Adam and Eve? Could we know that? I mean, obviously we can't know it directly, but could we work it out? So we have to keep in mind when everything was created, when God finished it, it was very good. And so we would see evidence of design. We would see well-designed skin. Right? So what would be the best sort of skin to have? Well, in fact, it wouldn't be white and it wouldn't be black either. And this is a mural we have at our Jurassic Ark site, if you can come and see that, as well as having wonderful fossils to dig up and or to see our display and wonderful gardens. We also have some murals that illustrate the real history of the world. And this is a beautiful mural that was made by our artist colleague, Steve Cardno, showing Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and quote from Genesis 1:31 there, and God saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. And so what color are Adam and Eve? Well, they would have the best skin there was. So they would have enough pigment to protect their DNA, but not too much that it stopped them from producing vitamin D. So that would equate to a sort of middle light brown color and a sort of soft rosy brown color. And in fact, most of the world's population are these days a sort of middle brown color. Black and white are actually minorities. So we need to look at the history of the human race, or the human species, right? As John quoted earlier, right? We all came from one man, as quoting the Apostle Paul. We are all the descendants of one man, and well, one man and his wife, who incidentally did come from him, but that's another interesting story. We can go into that some other time. So we are the descendants of Adam and Eve. And eventually you get to Noah and his wife. We mustn't leave out the wives. And Noah and his wife, they had 3 sons. So we have Japheth and his wife, Shem and his wife, and Ham and his wife. And it's interesting, those names start to give us an indication that skin color might be starting to break down a bit, because between Adam and Eve and between Noah, of course, we've had the fall of man and the degeneration of man. And by the time you get to Noah's time, yes, the world was very corrupt and God was grieved in his heart because of the corruption of human beings. But they have 3 sons who marry, and in their names there is a hint of their variations in color. So Japheth has the sense of fair or light. Ham, that name literally means sort of dark or burnt, or sort of, it means burnt, which has the connotations of dark. So we're having some variation in skin color already. Now, those 3 sons and their wives, after the flood, they all had sons and daughters, and gave rise to several generations who eventually became the people of Babel. And we do have the genealogies there. And the people of Babel eventually gave rise to all of the nations that we have on the earth. So again, going back to Genesis 32, which we've referred to earlier, from these, right, that's the descendants of Noah's 3 sons who gave rise to the people of Babel, who then gave rise to all of the people who are spread out all over the earth now. All of these nations, or all of these people groups, and if you look up that Hebrew word that's translated nations, it can also be used to mean people groups. All of the people groups spread abroad all over the earth. And you can read in Genesis 10, there's a very, very careful list of all of the people who were descended from Noah's 3 sons. So what we've got here is, how do we get to all of those different skin colors that we have on the earth now? And it's part of that world going downhill. We've actually got degeneration of the gene pool. So the original creation, a sort of middle brown color that was just right. Now, there'd be a little bit of variation in that. You can see that even within individual families these days who are all much the same color, but there's just a little bit of variation. But the original creation was very good. So enough melanin to protect your skin from the ultraviolet light, but not too much to get in the way of making vitamin D. By the time of Noah and the sons, you're starting to get a bigger spread. Something is starting to go wrong, probably with the control genes that stimulate the melanocytes as to how much they make and whether they stay switched on all the time or whether they vary their activity. By the time of Babel, after the flood, you've got a lot more degeneration happening after the flood. The environment has degenerated rapidly. We know that lifespans were going down. There was disease and all sorts of things and a lot of mutation. So by the time of Babel, you've got a bigger spread. You've got lots of variation in the color. So what happened after that? Well, by the time of Babel, you will have all of this variation in color. This is another mural made by Steve Cardno. It's that you can come and see at Jurassic Ark, showing you the real history of the real world as recorded carefully by the people who were there, or by God who was there, and then the people who were there. And so at the time of Babel, you would have had this variation, but the people were all together. Mixing was possible. After Babel, people were separated out. Now, we have the list of people who were separated out in Genesis 10. God would not have split up individual nuclear families, in fact, probably not even small groups of relatives. They were probably more like clan groups. So they would have shared the same sort of gene pool. Now, if you separate all of those into separate little clusters and they all then spread out and don't breed with one another, but just breed within their small group, you are going to get reinforcement of whatever genes they took with them from the original gene pool at the Tower of Babel. So we have separation, we have inbreeding for many generations before people started moving around the world and remixing. And so these days we have a lot of remixing because people are very mobile all over the world, and that's been going on for the last couple of 100 years. So we've got lots of remixing now. And the fact that they can remix reminds us, of course, that there's only one humankind, only one human species. There will be many of these different groups because you inherited whatever came from whatever your ancestors took with you out of the gene pool from the Tower of Babel. So this is everyone's history. We hear a lot about how we have to look at the history of all these different sort of people groups. Well, yes, we should, but we need to know what is the real history of all of those people groups, because this is their heritage as much as it is ours.